All right. Well, I think we'll get started here this morning. So good morning, everybody, for those of you who are able to attend this morning. And for those of you that are not, we will be recording this. We will be emailing this out to our email list after we complete it as well. So my name is Walker Sheik. I'm the agronomist and seed production specialist here with Millborn. And I'm going to give a brief, quick overview of kind of what hybrid rye is, how to manage it, and kind of what makes it different than other open pollinated varieties of rye as well. Okay, so what makes hybrid rye different, or what it is? So I guess kind of in the name, it's really just a hybrid of two parents that cross each other to make a superior variety or superior hybrid that has desirable traits better than what other open pollinated varieties would have. And those desirable traits or characteristics that we want to see out of hybrid rye would be better yield, better agronomic traits, and then better quality as well. So the first things that we see with the yield that help improve yield would be first the extensive tillering that hybrid rye can offer. Hybrid rye has about 10 to 14 stems or heads per plant, as opposed to open pollinated rye, which usually only has about 4 to 5. So you're getting a lot more stems per plant and a lot more heads per plant. And by doing that, you can lower your planting population as well, which will help increase the yield. And then we also see a lot larger ears, a lot more consistent uniform ears on these heads as well. So along with producing more of them, more stems, more ears, the ear size themselves and the grain fill is a lot better on hybrid varieties as well. Some of the agronomic characteristics that we see in hybrid rye versus other open pollinated varieties, hybrid rye has a much shorter stature. We usually see, I guess it depends on the variety and what you're comparing it to, but it can be anywhere from 6 inches to probably 2 feet with some varieties on how much shorter it is compared to other open pollinated varieties. It has a lot thicker stem as well. So besides being shorter to help it stand better, the thicker stem helps it stand better as well. And that picture here on your right is actually a pretty good visual on how the hybrid rye, the height of it and the standability of it, how much better it's able to stand and withstand wind and other circumstances that happen throughout the season as well. It's got a really good drought tolerance as well, especially some of the other varieties. The root system in hybrid rye is a lot more robust, a lot more bigger. So we see it do better in some of the drier, lighter ground and a lot better out west than some of the other open pollinated varieties do. Has a little bit better efficient use of nitrogen as well. With open pollinated rye, I think the rate is 1.4 pounds of nitrogen per bushel produced, and hybrid rye only uses about 1.2 pounds of nitrogen. And part of that is contributed to the extensive root system that hybrid rye has to offer as well. So it's a lot more efficient nitrogen user and fertilizer user as well. And it has a really good disease tolerance. Rye in general has a pretty good disease tolerance, mainly because it has a shorter window. It kind of matures fast enough before a lot of diseases can occur. But hybrid rye is even faster maturing. It avoids a lot of those diseases. It has better tolerance and resistance to some of those diseases. And the even maturity of it and the quick pollination of it reduces the chances of ergot within those varieties as well. And that's probably the biggest contributor to the high quality that hybrid rye can offer is the pollen plus technology that it has. And just to kind of a quick summary of what that is basically hybrid rye has a super fast, a super short pollination window. And by having a reduced or a smaller pollination window, that reduces the chances of ergot to set in. And ergot is probably the most, the low, how do I say this right? This is probably ergot reduces the quality of rye the most out of any other specs that rye would maybe have to meet. So lowering your ergot potential with hybrid rye is going to substantially increase your quality. Whereas open pollinated rye is still susceptible to ergot, not like how it has always been. And the even maturity of it too, it just helps with the low ergot potential as well. So really what hybrid rye offers that open pollinated rye doesn't currently would be the yield, the agronomic characteristics, and then the quality. And then how to manage it, what makes it different than managing open pollinated rye. It's a little bit more technical, a little bit more, you got to pay a little bit more attention to the details of it. But how we recommend it and how KWS recommends it is that we want to shoot for a planting rate of 0.8 units an acre. Now with hybrid rye, we sell it based on the units, and 1 unit is 1 million live seeds. So at 0.8 units an acre, you're actually planting at 800,000 live seeds an acre. And it depends on the lot, but each unit weighs roughly about 55 pounds. So if you're planting about 0.8 units, you're actually planting about 45 pounds an acre of actual seed. Now, when you compare that to open pollinated rye, I guess it depends who you talk to and what area you're planting in, but usually you kind of see 80, 90, 100 pounds an acre of open pollinated rye. So you're at about half the population with hybrid rye. It may look thin in the fall and even going into spring with that low population, but kind of going back to the extensive tillering that hybrid rye has, it's able to make up or compensate for that lower population. You're still getting more heads, you're still getting more stems, with less plants out there an acre. The planting depth is a little bit shallower on the hybrid rye as opposed to open pollinated rye. We actually shoot for about 3/4 of an inch to 1/8 of an or 0.8 inches deep in the ground. Planting time is still the same. I think for most of South Dakota or any of the states surrounding it, the whole month of September is a good time to plant. If you're in North Dakota, maybe the end part of August would be okay. And as you get south going into October, maybe early November will still be okay for that window as well. And if you want to try to get maybe some fall grazing out of it, planting earlier will help to get some more growth in the fall. Now the fertility of this stuff, we try to shoot, I use 100 bushels an acre basically just to make it easy. And that's kind of what we've seen be realistic with hybrid rye. But basically that table there that you can see is kind of a breakdown as to where those nutrients are going to be allocated to, whether it's to the grain or to the straw, and then the total removal rates at 100 bushels an acre. So with a 100 bushel an acre crop, you're probably looking at 200 pounds of N, 67 pounds of phosphorus, 180 pounds of potassium, and 24 pounds of sulfur. Now that's just the total usage. It doesn't contribute to what's already in the soil. It doesn't contribute to leftover nitrogen from the crop prior. It doesn't contribute any of that. That just simply states what the crop will use during the season to produce 100 bushels. And kind of what we've seen here, we've had a couple fields get off this year of hybrid rye to be combined. And personally, what I've seen and hearing from guys is that it seems when it's next to an open pollinated variety, I'm seeing about a 50 to 100% yield increase. So if you're combining open pollinated rye at 40, we've seen 80 bushels on the hybrid stuff, or 50 or 100. I mean, it's just about 50 to 100% difference is kind of what we've been seeing so far. So I think that's pretty realistic going forward. I think 100 bushels is nowhere near unrealistic at all with these varieties. And we do have the varieties we have, I think 4 or 5 this year that we're carrying, all can do better in certain situations, different soil types, different uses. So we try to match that with you guys too as well. The most important thing on making hybrid rye successful and making it produce the best for you would be the seeding rate, the depth, and the timing. 80% of what that rye is going to produce is how you plant it in the fall, or when you plant it in the fall. The rest, it just kind of carries itself out and does what rye usually does. But this takes maybe a little bit more attention, a little bit more time in preparing as opposed to just planting open pollinated varieties. So if there's any questions, feel free to type them in or ask or cut me off or anything. I mean, we want to make sure we get these answers questions here before we forget about them at the end. But if there's nothing about what I've talked about here recently, I can pass this off to Warren and he'll talk about what he's seen in some of his trials, his feeding trials. So
I got a quick question for Walker. This is Justin and Warren. Okay, so Walker talked a little bit about ergot and why the hybrid rye is less susceptible to more ergot. Can you give the walkthrough of ergot, how it sets in on seed, why it is, it's a threat to rye in general?
Yep. So how ergot sets in is that during pollination, wherever the pollen doesn't meet the plant, rye is a cross-pollinating crop. So whenever the pollen itself doesn't reach the plant, ergot will set in wherever that pollen doesn't reach. So in open pollinated varieties where the pollinating window is relatively longer, not as even, it kind of spreads out over a couple of weeks maybe. There is a lot more plants not being pollinated during that time, or the chances of them being pollinated is less. And so there's higher chances of ergot setting in instead. Whereas hybrid rye, the pollination window is super short. I think less than a week, and maybe even within a day or two sometimes. Um, and the pollen has a better chance of hitting all those heads, hitting all those plants at that time, and allowing less time for ergot to set in and replace that pollen instead. So that's the biggest reason, the biggest contributor as to why we see a lot less ergot within hybrid rye varieties as opposed to open pollinated rye.
No other questions so far.
Okay.
So we can hand it over to Warren.
All right. Well, I don't have any other questions so far, so we'll just hand it over to Warren.
Well, good morning, everyone. I will allow me to switch over and get my, there we go, get my screen shared. We will now, I'll start, bear with me for a moment. I got to get, I have too many screens open and not enough. Here we go. I think now we're ready. And I hope everyone can hear me. I'm going to turn on, or I'll start video also. Okay. Apologize for all that confusion. We'll get started on talking about evaluating and feeding hybrid rye for finishing steers. This is a project that about a year and a half ago, the folks at KWS approached us of our willingness to study this project, and it's certainly been an interesting ride over the last few months. I really, growing up in eastern South Dakota, Western Corn Belt, really didn't think we would ever be thinking about feeding something other than corn to finishing cattle. But I hope this presentation gives you some idea of what some possibilities are of using some alternative feeds like hybrid rye. As Walker already talked about, cereal rye offers a number of agronomic benefits in a crop rotation in terms of improvements in system resiliency, soil health, and so forth. And with the new hybrid germplasm that's available, compared to the population genetics we were using before, we got the potential for much greater yield potential, along with reduced risk of ergot incidence, of ergot infection rather. The question though, and we all know that anytime we have more than one market outlet for a grain, it gives us more options to market that crop in case one of the higher value market channels gets saturated. And in South Dakota, in the upper Midwest, livestock feed is one of those options that we really rely on as a way to make sure we can use up excess supply. The challenge with rye is there was just very little information on how well this might work in cattle diets. Much of the information that was available was old. And the most recent I've been able to find was from the 1980s, and some of it much, much older than that. Those studies were usually done with greater concentration of ergot alkaloids than what this new germplasm could potentially have. It was also prior to when we started adopting corn processing co-products. And we know that the addition of corn gluten feed or distillers has changed how we feed cattle. It's changed how they respond to diets. So there was a real need to re-examine rye as a cattle feed to see how it might fit into a modern beef cattle production system. And in the course of this project, we really had three key questions we wanted to answer. Number one is, will the cattle eat the feed? Number two, how well will the cattle perform? And then finally, what would be the energy value of hybrid rye, so we have some basis to price this feed stuff and some basis to compare it to corn. So the hybrid rye that we used in our study, and we started this in September of 2019, the grain was provided by KWS Cereals. We use KWS Bono. That was grown from a single farm in Minnesota. I should note that this feed was not screened or cleaned up for us. It was, my understanding, it was harvested, put in their bins, loaded on a truck, and hauled to our bin site. So it's as real world, I think, as what we could probably do on a research university setting. We did test this for ergot alkaloid concentration. It came up from the North Dakota State University Veterinary Diagnostic Lab at 392 parts per billion. And we'll talk a little bit more about why we think that may be important going on. We cracked this using a roller mill that was provided to us by one of the local manufacturers in the Beersford, Lenox area. We processed it to a test weight of about 42.5 pounds per bushel on average through the course of the study. The picture I have on this slide is of it's at 37 pounds, so that picture is a little more extensively processed than what we ended up averaging through the course of the feeding trial. The way we set the study up is we used 4 different treatments. Our base treatment was really a very standard Midwestern finishing diet where it was 60% dry rolled corn, then distillers, corn silage, and liquid supplement. And then we took that 60% corn that made up the base diet and replaced 1/3, 2/3, or all of it with rye. So we're going to see throughout the rest of this presentation this notation of 60 to 0, 40 to 20, 20, 40, and 0, 60. The first number represents the percentage of the diet that was corn. The second number represents the percentage of the diet that was rye. We used 240 head of Angus cross steers that came out of one consignment from one sale barn in central South Dakota. After a pencil shrink, they were weighing 890 pounds. We put 24 pens, 10 steers per pen, 6 pens for each treatment. Then we shipped those cattle off to Tyson when they hit 1/2 inch of back fat. And all of the results that we're going to present are carcass weight adjusted to a common dressing percentage of 62.5. As I said earlier, we started these cattle off in September. We sent them to Tyson right after the first of the year. In that month of December, we had a fair amount of rain and snow with temperatures that were above freezing more often than not down in Beersford. So the net result is we had cattle that were carrying a lot of mud and tag. Our dressing percentages were not particularly good. And so we wanted to eliminate any kind of noise we might have from a dressing percentage standpoint that really wasn't related to treatment. So we adjusted everything to the final for all the final body weights. It was hot carcass weight divided by 62.5%. These are the actual diets that we fed to the cattle. On the top line, that's the actual percentage of dry rolled corn on average through the course of the study. And then the hybrid rye is the second line. We did feed about 19% modified distillers, 17% approximately corn silage, and then the balance was liquid supplement that carried the rumensin along with the vitamins and trace minerals. You're going to notice on the nutrient composition that our crude protein content was not constant across all treatments. And we did that intentionally. We wanted to make the substitutions with corn to really get a handle on energy. However, rye has more crude protein than corn does. So every time we made that swap, we increased crude protein. If we could have made it all with the same crude protein content, but that would have meant we would have, for every time we pulled in 20 units of rye, we'd have been taking out something like 17, 18 units of corn and then another 3 units or so of modified distillers. That put more variability in terms of what our substitutions were and how to make those estimates for net energy value. So we made the choice that we were going to let crude protein content float and just simply make a 1-to-1 cereal grain swap. So if we were feeding these cattle in a real world commercial setting, that 0-60 treatment would not have been balanced to have 15% protein. We would have fed less distillers. So it's an important distinction to make. I don't think it affects our results in any way, but in terms of looking at this from a cost standpoint going forward, you would have been able to reduce some of the expense of distillers grain by feeding a greater portion of rye. So as I said on the outset, one of our first questions was whether or not these cattle were going to eat this feed and how they might perform. And it was certainly a bit nervous from our standpoint of these cattle we need to buy larger groups of real similar cattle. And anyone that understands feeder cattle marketing understands those kind of cattle cost more money. And so we had made a sizable investment in feeder cattle to start this project. And at least myself, I was certainly very concerned that we might have invested an awful lot of the university's resources and find out they just simply won't eat the feed we put in front of them. This shows the performance. The bars are average daily gain. The line is the feed to gain ratio for those 4 treatments for the first 19 days. We brought rye into the diet on day 8 and bumped them up to the final constant inclusion rate on day 14. And to our surprise, the more rye we fed these cattle during the adaptation phase, the more they gained and the more efficient they were. That was the opposite of what we were expecting. Because the book says that rye has less energy value than corn does. So we were expecting lower performance, not greater. But and we also saw, as you'll see in the next slide, we saw no difference in feed intake during this period. So the bottom line is these cattle adapted to rye very, very well. We had no problems getting these cattle started. In fact, possibly there's an advantage to using rye during the adaptation phase, because if we look at that 60-0 treatment, they didn't perform quite as well. And we'll talk about that, why some possible reasons might be in a couple slides. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide because I think this discussion of dry matter intake is really going to determine how we may be able to use hybrid rye in cattle diets in the future. You can see the 4 treatments across the top, the 60-0 over to the 0-60. This is a chart of dry matter intake over the course of the feeding period. And during the first, say 49 days or so, there was no difference between treatments in dry matter intake. These cattle they performed extremely well. They ate a lot of feed. We had no problem getting these cattle to consume, regardless of treatment, to consume feed through the first 49 to 50 so days of the experiment. However, once we got past about day 46, we started seeing these treatments diverge. The cattle with a greater inclusion rate of rye plateaued earlier and at a reduced level compared to the corn control or the 40-20 treatment. And so if we measured over the course of the feeding period, we had a linear decrease in as we increased rye inclusion, we decreased dry matter intake over the course of the experiment. And there's a few different ideas that we're exploring as some possible reasons. Can't necessarily prove any of them, but it's where we may be looking in the future as far as some future research work. One possibility might be ergot exposure. As I mentioned earlier, this feed had approximately 400 parts per billion ergot. If we start multiplying that out by inclusion rate, that means at that high treatment, we were at approximately 240 parts per billion. Now, that's certainly low enough that we're never going to see or shouldn't see any kind of toxicity symptoms. But we do know, though, from some work done with fescue in the southeast that's infected with endophytes that produce ergot alkaloids very similar to what we see with ergot in cereal grain, we know that at that level, or at least others have observed, that at that level of ergot alkaloid intake, they've seen depressions in dry matter intake. So it's possible that as we expose those cattle to ergot over a longer period of time and or increase the dose, because if you look over on that legend scale on the left, these cattle were eating a lot of feed, well over 30 pounds of dry matter towards the end of the feeding period. So as we're asking those cattle to eat more feed, it's possible that the level of ergot alkaloids was limiting their ability to eat. The other possibility, and we know that, and it fits a bit with what some of the Canadians have done in terms of small grain processing, is it's possible we over-process the rye. We selected that 42-pound test weight, or about 78, 79% of the original bulk density, based on work out of Canada where they've had success in processing barley. We know from other work that if we process barley to a greater extent, that'll depress dry matter intake. And we also know from some other work that the starch, although it's less starch than corn, it's more degradable than the starch in corn or barley. So it's possible that what also could have happened is in the early part of the feeding period, when we were feeding more roughage, they were able to tolerate that extra starch very easily. And as we were stepping those cattle up, they were doing fine until we were starting to reach, for the higher rye treatments, their peak intake, which may have been depressed because we have more fines than what would have been optimal. So one of the things we want to look at down the road is what is exactly the optimum processing method or degree of processing for rye, and is it the same as what we might use for corn or barley or other small grain? And it's also fine that we may also find out that it's simply something to do with rye, and that there may be a limitation as to how much that they will eat well or eat at maximal. But we need to do some additional work to really answer that question really fully. I wanted to throw this slide up because I think it explains some of the feed intake responses we saw, and may help explain some of the fact that those cattle started off so well. The picture on the left is a game camera photo of the 0% rye treatment about 7 hours after Scott fed those cattle in Beersford. And if you can see, it's maybe a little hard to tell with that shadow in the photo, but that bunk is slick. And that was consistent through the whole experiment, that by mid-afternoon, the corn control diets, they had their feed gone by 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon at the latest, and that was pretty consistent. On the right is the 60% rye treatment, with that photo taken 7 hours and 15 minutes after that pen of cattle had been fed. And you can see there's still a fair amount of feed left. That was also really consistent through the experiment, that it took those cattle longer to finish up eating their feed than did lower inclusion rates of rye. So I think that may be one of the reasons why we saw some of those differing responses, that early on that changing feeding pattern may have helped prevent some subacute acidosis, kept cattle on feed better. But towards the end of the period, as we were trying to ask those calves to eat more rye, we may have been actually depressing feed intake just simply because they ate more slowly, smaller meals. So that's something another area I'd like to explore on this whole rye feeding concept, is how does including rye change feeding behavior. All right, now we'll get into some actual results and showing what these cattle did and how we got paid. This is the carcass adjusted final body weight. Those blue bars, again, from left to right, 100% corn, all the way to the right is 100% rye. As we increased the amount of rye in the diet, we decreased the final body weight and hot carcass weight. But notice, though, the 60-0 and 40-20. Those two values are essentially equal. There's only just a few pounds difference, and well within the experimental error for comparing those two. We saw a similar pattern in terms of average daily gain and feed efficiency. This is measured over the entire feeding period. The yellow line shows average daily gain. The cattle on the corn control gained approximately 4.7 pounds per day. That's carcass adjusted. As we went all the way over to 100% rye, those steers gained 4 pounds a day. Again, between the 60-0 and 40-20, statistically, those really aren't different, 4.68 versus 4.6. Feed efficiency are the blue bars. The 60-0 cattle gained right at 6.0 to 1. 40-20s were essentially the same at 6.03. As we added more rye, they became less efficient, going up to about a 6.4 and a 6.6, respectively, as we went from 40 or 60% rye in the diet. One of the other things that we need to keep in mind when we're in any kind of nutrition experiment with finishing cattle is making sure that we at least do no harm in terms of carcass merit and carcass characteristics. I have these categorized in prime, premium, choice, and select grades for each of the 4 treatments. The good news is here that we didn't negatively affect carcass merit, percentage choice at all by any of the things that we did. There's some subtle differences in terms of heights of those bars, but statistically speaking, they weren't different. I don't have I'm not showing the yield grade slide, but that looks very much the same. No differences in terms of the yield grade distribution. We did see some subtle differences. Ribeye area followed live body weight, as you might expect. That as we added more rye, we saw smaller ribeyes, but it wasn't a tremendous difference. It wasn't like we completely removed all the muscle out of those cattle. We also did reduce dressing percentage as we increased rye. Really don't have a great explanation for that. And in my mind, considering that the entire group dressed pretty poorly, I would be real cautious drawing any strong conclusions based on this one study, considering the amount of mud we dealt with. One of the other things we did also look at is we looked at liver abscess scores. Liver abscesses are becoming a real challenge for the feeding industry because it makes those livers unsellable, so less attractive from the packer standpoint. And unfortunately, only really great way we have to control that is to feed Thailand. And we're getting retailers and consumer markets, restaurants are giving us some pushback in terms of they would prefer us to use less antibiotics and less reliance on Thailand. So one of the things we wanted to do was to see if changing grain source had any effect. Unfortunately, we can look at this as a glass half full, glass half empty. We did not change either the severity or the incidence of liver abscesses. So while we didn't find the silver bullet that solved the problem, we also didn't create anything that made the problem worse. So from that standpoint, it was really kind of a neutral in terms of liver abscess data. So finally, our estimated net energy value, based on our experiment, we came up with an estimate of 57 megacals per 100 for NEG. That falls right in line with the two standard reference sources that we use to evaluate feedstuffs, and comes out at approximately 84% of the value of dry rolled corn. So the conclusions that we drew from our experiment was that rye can be successfully fed to finishing cattle. Granted, at least in our study, as you increased the amount of rye in the diet, we depressed dry matter intake later in the feeding period, and that resulted in reduced average daily gain and poorer feed efficiency when you measure it over the entire feeding period. The energy concentrations were about 84% of that of dry rolled corn, so we can use that to help guide some pricing decisions. And we think there's an opportunity for some additional work to examine some of the mechanisms why we might have seen reduced dry matter intake and performance. So with that, I'm going to wrap up with about 2 or 3 questions or just kind of thoughts that I've had as I've worked with this project for the last few months, things where I see we might be able to use rye in integrated livestock systems. Some of the unanswered questions I have from a cattle feeding standpoint is how could we use rye as a higher moisture grain and harvest it early? Could we start cattle on higher rye diets early and then more gradually shift them over to corn to maybe take advantage of those differences we saw in intake patterns to try to optimize both feedstuffs? Are there some ways that we could change how we manage rye, or to mitigate some of those differences we saw with feed intake that might allow us to use higher inclusion rates? The other area we haven't really looked at all yet is what might happen if we're doing using rye as perhaps the sole cereal grain source in a backgrounding diet with a higher percentage of perhaps corn silage, hay, rilage, whatever we may be using for a roughage standpoint. How might that fit? My bias is that I think that could fit really, really well, but that might be an interesting study to look at down the road to prove whether or not that is or isn't the case. I'd come up with this kind of thought experiment to compare 2 different farms, each at 1,200 acres. The comparison on the left is our traditional 2-crop rotation that we use in a lot of eastern South Dakota and the upper Midwest, where 600 acres of corn, 600 acres of soybeans. And just looking at this from a feed grain standpoint, and I plugged in 180 bushel corn yield, and we can discuss whether that's appropriate in your operation or not. But there's a lot, I think, there's a lot of places that would use that as kind of the target as they're making some plans. So then I compare that to, say, that same 1,200 acre land base, and instead we go 400 corn, 400 rye, 400 soybeans. And again, just looking at the feed grain supply, the work that's been done at the Southeast farm has shown that when they add a 3rd crop to a rotation, they've been able to increase corn yields by 10%. So I bumped up the corn yield in this example to 200, and I used 100 bushel as an example theoretical rye yield. When I add all of that up, the corn and the rye production, that's an additional 12,000 bushels of feed grain for that example on the right. And using the inclusion rates that we used at that 2-to-1 ratio, or the equivalent of that 40-20 study, that's enough to support an additional 275 head of yearling steers. I think one place why our maybe it's just a lucky accident but where that 2/3 corn, 1/3 rye seems to be the most attractive of the rye options, also matches up really identically with what this theoretical 3-way crop rotation farm might actually produce: 2 bushels of corn for every bushel of rye. I think, in my opinion, the biggest advantage for considering, at least, adding rye to a integrated crop livestock operation is it increases some options for us. We can harvest things earlier for a forage crop, possibly catch a double crop after that. We can allow this crop to go mature for grain. We can either feed that or sell it to a higher value market. If the marketplace is paying us enough, we can sell the rye and buy corn if we have to. But it also lets us then provide that straw to either sell or use on our own operation for bedding. I think one of the key kind of benefits doesn't really get talked about a lot, but it reduces our reliance on corn stalks. I've seen too many instances where Mother Nature just doesn't cooperate with us well as we get into late November, early December, and we get an early snowstorm that we weren't quite prepared for, and we haven't got all the corn stalks harvested we wanted to. Having a small grain in the mix gives us the opportunity to put some straw up early, and makes us less dependent on ideal weather in the late fall. To wrap things up, we'd like to again thank KWS Cereals for the financial support of this project and for providing the in-kind contribution of rye grain. Also like to recognize Scott Bird for his work. He is the individual that takes care of the cattle out at the Southeast Research Farm at Beersford, does an outstanding job, and wanted to make sure we publicly thanked him for doing an excellent job of taking care of these cattle during the course of the experiment. This is my contact information. The folks at Millborn would have this also. I will, that concludes the end of my slideshow. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I do need to be leaving here in a few minutes. I've got about 3 big things going on today. This was number 2. We've got another webinar going on a little later today. So I'm going to I won't be able to stay for the entire program, but I would be happy to answer any questions if anyone has any. Looking at Craig, did we do any cost of gain comparisons? No, we didn't, because you'd have to tell me what rye is worth. Now, I was at a program yesterday where someone offered that there were some places paying offering $4.50 for hybrid rye. In that case, it would make absolutely no sense to feed rye to cattle if you could, when we could buy corn for $3 or so. So the cost of gain really would depend on what that relative price difference between corn and rye. The other thing we didn't include also is the effect of pulling out just a little bit of distillers to equalize the protein content. I did a very rough calculation, and again, this is a little on the crude side, so you'd probably I wouldn't take my word for it. I'd visit with your nutritionist and double check, but considering the fact that we can pull out a little bit of the protein supplement and then substitute the corn at that 40-20 level, roughly speaking, if rye was equal to the price of corn, then the cost of gain should be equivalent. So as I see it going forward, whether or not this fits, it somewhat depends on whether or not we need to provide all the feed within the individual operation or not. If we're buying or have that option, then I think it's going to depend on what that ratio is from corn to rye. But it looks to me like, at least at that lower blend, that if the price is roughly equal, the cost of gain would be roughly equal. Cost of gain as a whole on this cattle would have been really competitive. These cattle were, as I said, they came in weighing 900. They had frames to be 10.5. We got a lot of compensatory gain. They were really efficient, as you can see. The cost of gain was pretty cheap on these. These were a fun set to feed. Anything else before I sign off? Well, I'd like to thank the folks at KWS for inviting me. With that, I will shut off my video and let the next speaker share their screen.
Perfect. Thanks, Warren. Becca, you're up next. Dr. Becca Bertain, she's a nutritionist with KWS, and she's done a lot of work with swine feeding diets with hybrid rye, as well as someone on the cattle side as well, and helped a lot with the SDSU research project and getting that going. So Becca's going to do this presentation and tie in a little bit of what Warren said and put some economics and dollars and figures to it. So with that, take it away, Becca.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. So I've been with KWS about 2 years now, and as mentioned, I've done quite a bit of work with different feeding experiments and just better understanding how hybrid rye really fits into our whole integrated system and into different livestock diets. So we saw Warren's presentation about how those cattle performed, what we fed them, and so the next real question is what is the value of hybrid rye and how do I go about deciding if it fits into my system? So I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction in terms of how we evaluate feed ingredients and determine value. I'm going to talk to you about evaluating hybrid rye individually as an ingredient. And then I want to talk to you about putting some dollars to it. So what does it look like if you are just trading a commodity? What does it look like if you're an integrated farmer? So you're growing your own crops to feed your own livestock. And then what's some added value, or is there added value for utilizing hybrid rye? So first, just jump into our introduction. I know we're not talking about hogs, but I really like this quote from Dr. Robert Easter from the University of Illinois. He says that the objective of swine nutrition is to provide each nutrient in both quantity and form that will precisely meet the pig's requirements for growth, reproduction, milk production, and if necessary, maintenance at the least possible cost. And ultimately, I think that's what it comes down to when we're feeding livestock, is that regardless of what our goals are, what we're trying to accomplish, we want to do that as efficiently as possible with the least possible cost. So cost is always one of our leading considerations when we're selecting feed ingredients for a diet. And then we want to make sure that all of those feed ingredients have the required nutrients we need for those animals to maintain, to grow, or to reproduce. And so then we can assign nutritional values to different feed ingredients to basically compare cost. So whether that's between hybrid rye and corn and wheat, it's really good for us to be able to say, what is the value of a feed ingredient? So we need to back up just a little bit if we're going to be able to assign a value and kind of better understand what an animal's nutrient requirements are. So there are 6 essential nutrients that a calf or a pig or us need, and those are carbohydrates, protein, fat, vitamins, minerals, and water. Now, the first 3 are typically the ones we talk about the most, and of those, typically protein or energy tend to be the most expensive in our diets. So energy can be provided from carbohydrates, fat, and protein. These all yield energy, but in our cereal grains, carbohydrates are a major source of energy. It's important to remember, though, that our cereal grains also can have protein. And crude protein is really critical for formulating our ruminant diets. If we're talking about swine, we'd be more concerned about amino acids, but we know that smaller grains, especially hybrid rye, tend to have a higher protein value than that of corn. And so like Warren said, it's not just as easy to say, well, let's compare the energy values, and it's a 1-to-1 comparison, or 84% the value. And that's what we're going to go off of. We still have to factor in these other essential nutrients because they provide value as well. So corn and soy have been our industry standards for energy and protein here in the Midwest. No surprise, corn is king. We grow lots of it. It's readily available, and it's a pretty typical energy source for all of our livestock diets. However, we know that small grains such as wheat, hybrid rye, barley, and oats can all be excellent energy sources. I do quite a bit of work in Canada, and I also work with several colleagues in Europe. And I find it quite humorous that when I go over to Europe or Germany and I meet with the nutritionists there, and they all swear to me that pigs have to be fed small grains and they will not grow unless they're fed small grains. And then I travel back to the US and I meet with a swine nutritionist here, and they swear to me that pigs only can grow on corn and they have to be fed corn or they're not going to grow. It actually turns out that both nutritionists are right, but they can grow on both. And as long as we're meeting those nutrient requirements, that's really the important ticket. The other thing that comes into play is price, right? And so this we know fluctuates based on seasonal variability, markets, all sorts of things can affect what price is for a commodity. So we should be able to determine a cost effectiveness or a nutritional value for a potential feed ingredient. And so that's what I'm going to attempt to do here, comparing hybrid rye with other cereal sources. So let's talk about evaluating hybrid rye. So we're in the Midwest, corn is king. And so let's compare it to corn. This is our gold standard in the United States for energy feed. It's an excellent source of energy for cattle finishing diets, dairy diets, swine. And this is because it has a really high starch content. And starch is a rapidly available sugar, very digestible, and it contributes to this high energy value. We also know that corn is highly palatable. Livestock eat it. We don't typically have intake issues on corn, but it does have some limitations. First of all, we know that it's quite a bit lower than our other cereals in crude protein. And as we push corn for higher and higher yields, we've seen that crude protein number dip down further and further. And as protein has become more and more expensive in our cattle diets, this is an important consideration. And as that number falls lower and lower, it actually deters some of the value of corn when we're talking about our diets. Another limitation is, Warren touched on this briefly, but our corn diets can be rapidly digested by those cattle and sometimes can lead to issues of acidosis or subacute ruminal acidosis in our adaptation phases and through those feedlot diets. And this is because it's rapidly digestible and it has really minimal fiber components. So lots of good that comes with corn. We're very familiar with feeding it, but it does come with a few limitations. So let's talk about hybrid rye. It's a fairly good energy source, right? We learned from Warren's presentation, it's about 85% the value of corn. Some book values have it closer to 90, but it falls roughly somewhere in there. It also has a higher fiber content. Warren talked on how this may alter the feeding pattern or behavior in cattle and maybe minimize some of those risks of acidosis. So this is certainly an advantage when we're talking about feeding finishing cattle. It also has a greater crude protein value, meaning that one of those very expensive nutrients to provide, we'll have a little bit more in this feed ingredient. Another thing that's unique with the hybrids, we touched on this as well, is there's a minimal risk for ergot contamination. So we're not as concerned about this as we were with some of the old varieties of rye. And I think Warren's data shows that it's highly palatable, so that's not an issue. We do have limitations. And I think the first and the biggest one is currently there's minimal acreage available and grown in the US market. And right now it primarily goes for milling and distilling. Those milling and distilling contracts are quite a bit higher. You heard Warren say they're offering $450. I've seen them higher than that delivered to Minneapolis. I think it's $545 right now. But this is for the highest quality hybrid rye. It has to meet all of their quality parameters in terms of falling number, test weight, lots of things. Just like wheat going into milling market, it has to meet all of those quality parameters. But because of this, the rye that's going this direction can be very high priced compared to corn. And so that makes it less attractive. We don't want to be paying food grade prices to go into a feeding market. Another limitation that we sometimes see with hybrid rye is that really fine grinding can make it dusty and unpalatable. So that's something to keep in mind. And also poor management can still result in some risk for ergot contamination. So I always recommend testing prior to using in a livestock diet. So I pulled book values from the NRC for various feed ingredients. You have corn across the top. Its book value for crude protein from the NRC is 9%. I think some people will argue that this may be lower than that. It has a net energy of about 64. And then you can see I have wheat, rye, barley, and oats also included there. And I just wanted to show how we can calculate basically a comparison or a comparative value using the two main limiting nutrients, so energy and crude protein. And so I wanted to calculate a relative energy value price for hybrid rye relative to corn. So using those values on the last slide, we know that corn has a net energy of about 64, rye 59. But we always talk about price per bushel for a lot of these commodities, but we have to keep in mind that they don't always, a bushel weight is not the same for all ingredients. Ironically, it is for corn and rye. They're both 56 pounds to a bushel, but for example, wheat weighs about 60 pounds. Oats only weigh about 32 pounds to the bushel. So when we're talking a bushel price, it's really important for feeding that we convert this to a weight basis. And it's why we typically trade our commodities in the feeding market on a per ton basis. But I know corn is not 375 right now, but for an ease of math, let's say corn's 375 a bushel. So if we're just comparing energy to energy, what should we pay for rye per bushel? Well, if we do a little bit of math, we can determine how much that costs per pound of feed. And then we can compare the energy values. So we know that in these book values, rye has 92% the value of corn. So if we take that 92% and multiply it by the price per pound we could pay for corn, it tells us that if corn is 375, we can afford to pay about 346 per bushel for our rye. So we can do the same thing for each of the feed ingredients, but then we can also do it for protein, right? So these small grains typically have more protein than our corn does. And so you'll see that the price we could pay per bushel if we're using it as a protein source is quite a bit higher than the price we would pay if we were just using it as an energy source. So like Warren said, where rough pencil math, if we were to take out some of that distillers to keep our protein value the same, we suggest that hybrid rye likely needs to be priced very competitively or similarly to corn to be incorporated into a finishing diet. And that's because it has a little bit less energy, but it has a little more protein. So it's a way to calculate a value for a feed ingredient and compare them. So this is what it looks like if you are just trading and purchasing commodities. But I think the question is, what if you are an integrated farmer? What if you are growing your own crops and feeding your own livestock? Then I think the discussion becomes a little bit different because we have to start talking crop budgets, seed cost, input costs, and then what does it cost to produce this energy that we're feeding to livestock? So I put together a little crop budget here. Obviously, you can input your own numbers. This may be different for everybody's system. I put a yield of 180 bushels to the acre for corn and 100 for our hybrid rye. Now, one of the things that I think really sets hybrid rye apart compared to corn is its decreased input cost. We typically say that it's a half or less the input cost to grow a hybrid rye crop than it is a corn. And this is for a couple different reasons. Seed costs are typically less. We typically don't incur a drying cost. Pesticide, herbicide, and fungicide cost for hybrid rye can sometimes even be zero. So that's quite a bit lower. And when you start factoring all that in, it just costs less to grow a high quality hybrid rye crop than it does to grow a high quality corn crop. So there across total direct cost, you can see an estimated input cost for growing these different crops. The next thing I wanted to do was calculate how much energy could we produce for our livestock per acre. Now, obviously corn is high yielding. On top of that, it's high energy. So per acre, we're going to produce a lot of energy for that corn. But the question is it more efficient to, or more economically efficient to be producing this energy in corn or a different commodity? So then I took that input cost and calculated how much it costs to produce each unit of energy. And to me, what I found was very surprising was that all of the small grains are actually cheaper to produce as an energy source than corn is. And hybrid rye comes out the cheapest of all of those. And that's because it's high yielding, but it still has a relatively low input cost. So I think this is something you certainly have to keep in mind, that for an integrated farmer, your price and what you value that commodity as is not as simple as, well, corn's worth $3.05 right now, I want my rye needs to be worth $3.05. I think it becomes more, we have to look at the whole system. Now, the other thing that we haven't really talked about yet that I think is a huge added value for hybrid rye, especially for that integrated farmer, is what else and what additional benefits can you get out of this type of rotation? So we've talked a little bit about this, some other people have mentioned it, but we're talking first is crop diversity. So when you're introducing a diversified rotation, you're breaking up soil pest issues, you're breaking up health challenges for those crops, you're improving your soil health and quality. This is a crop that offers a winter cover. And then on top of that, you can follow it with a high quality cover crop, whether that's a nitrogen fixing legume or something to improve nitrogen availability in the soil for the crop after your hybrid rye. As the SDSU data says, you know, typically a 10% yield advantage in your corn the next year when you include a small grain into your rotation. So there's some added value that obviously wasn't even touched upon in that budget. On top of that, there's the straw scenario. Like Warren said, you're not relying on corn stalks, but there's some years where straw is worth a lot of money. And that certainly should factor into what the bottom line is and what this cost of production is and how your break even really factors out with this feed stuff. The other thing is we have a sort of labor resource management shift. So we're taking some acres that typically you'd be rushing to get planted in the spring and hurrying to get harvested in the fall. And we're shifting those to a fall planting and a summer harvest. And this also gives you some flexibility for things like manure management and manure application. So I think those are some really value-added opportunities that sometimes get overlooked when we're talking about incorporating a small grain into your rotation. And the other thing that I think is really important is market flexibility and diversity. We know that when economic times get really tough, it's those more diversified operations that tend to come out on top and that tend to weather a storm. And this is because you have market flexibility. Let's say you have an incredible rye crop, it meets all the quality specs, and you're able to sell high quality rye, $5 a bushel into the distilling market, and you sign a distilling contract. Obviously, it makes the most sense for you to capitalize, sell your $5 bushel rye, and buy the extra corn you need. Let's say corn prices are good, and you've seen a good opportunity to market your corn, and hybrid rye prices are down a little bit. Sell your corn and feed your hybrid rye. This market flexibility, I think, really gives an operation an opportunity to have a better stream of income and manage that income, and you're not just reliant on one feed crop for your livestock operation. And ultimately, this just means more money on the bottom line. So a little bit of conclusions here. I think we've seen from my data and Warren's that hybrid rye offers a really favorable nutritional profile. We know it can be incorporated into livestock diets as an alternative to corn. The economic value, though, really depends on your marketing system. It looks different if you're just purchasing commodities to feed. In this way, it needs to be priced competitively to corn. But if you're an integrated farmer, I think there's some really large benefits to incorporating a small grain like hybrid rye into your rotation, both agronomically and as producing livestock feed. And that's because the cost of production and the yield combination with hybrid rye really makes it an attractive feedstuff. And I think the nutritional value of hybrid rye also makes it unique to corn. We talked about some of the feed intake, feeding behavior differences that Warren saw. And so maybe there's some even added value for small grain like hybrid rye to be noted and incorporated into your operation. So with that, this is my contact information. Email or phone are both a great way to reach me. And if there's nothing else, I will take any questions.
Becca, we did have one question. Wondering if you could show the slide comparing protein and other levels of rye compared to corn again.
Yes, I sure can. Hang on just a second. This slide?
I believe that was the slide. Dave, do you have any additional questions on that slide? All right, we'll leave that up for a second there, and Dave's taking a look at that.
Perfect.
Any additional questions for Becca? All right. If not, I think then, thank you, Becca, for taking the time to present with us today. And with that, I think we'll turn it over to Justin.
Awesome. Okay, so we're ahead of schedule. We scheduled this till noon, so I've got about 9 slides. So we're going to try to draw this out for the next hour, so we take full advantage of our Zoom time. So get comfy. We'll really cover these in depth that way. But this does tie in a lot to what everybody else has said, especially what Becca was alluding to when we're looking at doing this on our own farms. How do we incorporate this in? What does it look like? What are some of those, side effect benefits of doing rye on our farms, and taking a look at what it does take to put it into our own operation. So I want to look at it from the perspective as a livestock producer versus somebody who just wants to grow hybrid rye, who doesn't have livestock and then wants to market the rye. So we're going to cover both of those scenarios. I think as a cattle producer, the best crop rotation where it really fits in well is on those acres where we know we're taking silage off. So whether we're growing corn silage or sorghum silage or peas and oats for silage, that silage taken off in the months of June through September 1st gives us that window of opportunity to come in and plant hybrid rye. And like Walker talked about, hybrid rye does need to get planted on time to promote tillering in the fall. So we do want to get that planted, in the month of September, and usually by the, like the 20th of September or so. But usually most years with corn, we can do that. Okay. So we planted our corn silage, we take that off, we planted hybrid rye. All right. Following year, we harvest hybrid rye off now, like mid-July through end of July. Now we've got this really cool window where if we've got manure to haul, we can get manure out there, and that, we talk about timing and all that. That's a great window to spread time out for us. We're not crunched in the fall and the spring. Now we've got another opportunity to plant a second crop, whether it's something to graze in the fall and winter, or, if we can get millet planted in July late July, there's another little hay crop. Okay. So all those little benefits. If we're a crop farmer, we don't have livestock, there are years, especially when we move south of here into Iowa. I know we can get soybeans off in the month of September. Doesn't always happen, but on occasion that does happen. That usually fits in with the corn crop. But once again, if we have hybrid rye and we're taking it off in July, well, now we can put something like a soil building cover crop. We got more legumes in there. We can incorporate a cool season legume cover crop mix in there. So we're really getting crop diversity and promoting soil health that way. If we're moving west of here, it can fit into a wheat rotation. when we do rye, we always want to be, a little bit of ways away from wheat. So it usually works out where we're doing spring wheat. Spring wheat comes off in August. Then we're able to put hybrid rye back on there. Like I said, in September, do a little cover crop. After that, rye comes off. Go back to corn and soybeans for 2 rotations though. So we're moving away from hybrid rye as far as contamination back to wheat, in that 3rd rotation again. So that's kind of what the rotations look like, I guess. So now to break down each of these and what it would look like on a farm. Okay, so this scenario with all these numbers and that on there may be a little bit elementary, but I think it actually does portray a pretty good image of what we can do with the 20-acre field. So let's just say we've got 100 cows, okay? We've got 100 stock cows. We're able to go to grass with them for the majority of the year, but we usually has the months of January, February, March, April, and most of May to be feeding, okay, before they go back to grass again. So just a really, really broad diet, right? Obviously, this is going to change when you're calving and, when your lactation times are, all that stuff. But if we have 30 pounds of corn silage in the diet, roughly 20 pounds of something dry roughage, whether you're feeding corn stalks or ditch hay, straw, whatever it is that you're incorporating into that diet, and then we'll need various amounts of protein, okay? Everybody kind of understands that. But, okay, for those 100 cows in that 150-day window, it's going to take about 225 tons of corn silage, 150 tons of roughage. Okay, if we're a backgrounding operation, and this is where I think this cattle producer model really fits the majority of people here in eastern, central South Dakota, into southwest Minnesota, northwest Iowa. This model for cattle producers works pretty good. Okay, we got 100 calves on feed, usually from the months of November, December, January, February. We start to on-thaw, and then we get rid of our calves. So that we got a 120-day feeding window where, once again, we're using corn silage, we're using some sort of roughage, but now we've got this opportunity to put rye in there. So when we stick rye in there, and we can offer that at 10 pounds per day along with our corn silage and our grass hay, we'll still need just a little bit of protein, not much. Actually, it comes down quite a bit when I was running numbers. That uses up another 60 ton of silage plus about roughly 2,100 bushels of rye, okay? So from a 20-acre field, we can do this about perfect. From 20 acres, if we get 20 ton per acre corn silage, it gives us 400 tons of silage. If our yield for hybrid rye is 100 bushels, now we've got our 2,000 bushels of rye, and we just gained some straw that we can use for bedding. It's not the complete system, but I thought this was a pretty cool example of what we can do with just 20 acres, incorporating rye on those silage acres and putting them into the rotation, okay? All right, these got covered really well already, so I don't want to beat a dead horse here. But hybrid rye, comparing that to other feedstuffs, we know our crude protein levels are higher. We are really, really reliant on the ethanol industry to support our protein needs, and that really, really got opened up here as we went through the COVID stuff with ethanol. Market's getting pretty tight with distillers. So I think that, it just showed us a weakness in our feeding industry, that homegrown protein is going to be key, for stability on farms. So rye does give us some of that stability. The fiber content of rye is awesome. And that is, Warren was talking about less acidosis issues. That's what it's all about, gut health, right? And he talked about how the higher the inclusion rate of rye in the bunks, the longer it took them to eat it. And they ate it at a slower rate throughout the day. And I don't know how much everybody understands rye and the health benefits of rye flour and bread, but rye bread is some of the healthiest bread you can eat. And it is, it's your gut is fuller through the carbohydrate chains that rye has. And so that is also very, very true when we're feeding it to livestock as well. Okay, so let's look at this really cool double cropping situation with rye and what that also brings in for income or other opportunities. So we do want that window to be in late July in order to get millet in. Okay, we can plant 25 pounds per acre of millet. It's going to cost us $18 an acre. And usually, by late September, we can capture another 1.5 to 2 tons of dry matter of German millet. That also fits really well back into that cow diet or that backgrounding diet. as that hate source. And we got that off the same year that we got our hybrid grain. So that's good if we can do that in a good year. We know that we can always get a grazing cover crop established, even in the month of August. So if rye harvest gets late, that's okay. Let's just put those acres to grazing. We're doing mixes like a premium graze blend where we've got some warm season grasses and hybrid brassicas, radishes, turnips, rape seeds. We can do really diverse blends at that time of year too, because we got the growing window to support it. I put the cost per acre on those. Your grazing days, everybody asks how many grazing days can you expect from a cover crop. Typically, when we're comparing it to corn stalks will usually give us, 30 days of grazing, 1 head per acre, where our cover crops will do about 45 to 50 days of grazing at the rate of 1 head per acre. So certainly better than corn stalks. Usually the best way to do this, and let's just, picture that image of your 20 acres that you took corn silage off and you planted hybrid rye on it. And then now you have a cover crop on in those 20 acres. If you've got those next to a cornfield, that's usually the best way to utilize a cover crop, because you get your corn stalks that provide a lot of roughage, but you need some protein always. And that's where your cover crop with your high percentage of brassicas comes in well. Cows graze between corn stalks and cover crops really, really well, and it supports that system awesome. Okay, so the agronomic benefits of what this rye model looks like. Obviously, we talked about the spreading out of the harvest window and the planting window. That is huge. It spreads a lot of risk, not only with time, but weather risk, climate risks are also important. If you don't have livestock on your own, it's becoming more important for dairies and swine operations to utilize manure and get rid of manure more efficiently throughout the year. So those producers that do have a small grain on their rotation have the opportunity to buy fertilizer cheaper when they can put on manure in July. So that's huge. So that opens up that opportunity to actually get manure on your land when other years you probably wouldn't have, because everybody can take it in the fall, but usually that gets a little bit late for some of these folks that are trying to get manure off in the summer. We talked about that 10% increase in bushels per acre of corn when we do have a cereal grain in the rotation, and that's been proven time and time again with wheat in the rotation. The same will happen with rye too. So ground cover is huge. As far as, this whole plan of having a living root on our land all the time and maintaining ground cover, having weed suppression promoted through a growing plant and preventing erosion, those are all awesome benefits. So at Millborn, we're still going to use open pollinated rye, and I think there's still a use for open pollinated rye. So I just wanted to go through where you would and would not use open pollinated versus hybrid rye. Obviously, if your goal is to grow the most rye and sell it for grain or put it in a feeding ration, you're going to use hybrid rye every time. Okay, your yield potential is so much more. Like Walker talked about, it's going to be nearly double the amount of grain that you can produce per acre. If you simply want to plant rye and use it for calving on it in the spring, you go use open pollinated. Okay, it's going to break dormancy a very similar time and get you that growth fast. But the difference is if you're not going to take it to grain, your cost for the seed isn't going to be, it's not going to be the same. It's going to be cheaper for open pollinated. So use the cheapest thing you can for the fastest growth that you can get in the spring. Erosion control, that's the same as calving out in the spring. Talked about getting as much feed as possible. You're going to use hybrid rye. If you're going to sell seed to your neighbors or you want to produce cover crop rye seed, you can't use hybrid rye. Okay. Hybrid market is such that it cannot go back into the seed industry. So if your goal is to do that, just use open pollinated rye. And then, like I just said, if you do want to have rye that will go back into the milling or the distilling industry, use hybrid rye. Most of those millers or distillers are speccing hybrid rye, and that comes down to the quality factor. There's less ergot. They'll even talk quality specs with test weight and protein. Hybrid rye, it's so consistent. Open pollinated rye, it encompasses 10, 15 different older varieties that have all been mishmashed, and there's absolutely no consistency to it. So if you're a baker and you're producing flour, you want to have the same the same process every time. And so if you have the same product coming in, you're going to promote the use of hybrid rye. And that's what most of those millers are doing now. And they're speccing hybrid rye. So that's a good thing for the growers. We have helped a lot of producers start to market some of their grain that they're producing. And I'm just going to go through a list of what or who those buyers would be. Grain millers is one that does use quite a bit. And out of all of these, they're probably the most used that our growers have worked with. And they've got a mill in St. Ansgar, Iowa. Obviously, they would contract that ahead of time, and they would have quality specs in place. They do have a fleet of trucks, and they're able to come get it from your farm if you want them to. Brooks Grains and Schooler Grains, they're going to be grain merchandisers for other millers and distilleries. So essentially, they're the middleman for all these other people that are sourcing rye to distill or put in their mills. But those are two outlets. And then there is a company called Healthy Food Ingredients in Watertown, and they do procure just a little bit. Not huge users, but certainly an outlet again too. And we can get you more contact information for the right people to talk to if you are interested in pursuing those. So with that, God dang it, I'm about 45 minutes short of taking it to noon. But that kind of concludes everything we wanted to talk about. We got a few questions. I'm just going to let Courtney ask those questions, and then we can really open it up and have a bit of a discussion here.
So Craig had a question for Becca, wondering if you can process it, high moisture, and put it into a bag system.
Yeah, so this is a really good question, and it's one of the things that we've actually been talking quite a bit about. And so I'm actually going to pull some knowledge that we know from South America, and they process a lot of small grains and feed them this way. We have not tested it here in the States in our systems, but yes, we definitely believe you can. And it's one of the things that Warren and I have talked a lot about is testing high moisture rye. And we think it definitely could work into our feeding systems here. And we also think it could work well to help extend high moisture corn piles and things like that. So I don't have any data here in the US to show you, but yes, we definitely think it's an opportunity and a viable way to be using your hybrid rye.
Craig is wondering, does SA process it?
Who's SA?
Yes, so they will typically grind it some.
South America.
I would say it's some of each, but yes, and also some will process or will harvest it more as like an earlage, similar to corn, to get some added fiber with it as well. So just different options there. Yeah, so I see your question. So it could be rolled like barley. So actually our processing for the SDSU trial, we determined processing based on how they process barley in Canada. And we're also getting ready to start some steam flaking work to see how it holds up for steam flaking and how it feeds steam flaked. And then we're also doing some work in Canada where we're going to be temping it and seeing how it performs that way, which I think would be very similar to high moisture and putting it in a bag system processed.
I have a question. Are there any more soil health aspects of hybrid rye?
I think one of the big things is we talk about soil health and compaction issues and just the root mass that's available from rye compared to other cereals. I think that's certainly one of the big things that sometimes we talk about having that ground cover, breaking up disease cycles and things like that. But just the amount of biomass that's in the roots from the hybrid rye, I think is really unique and definitely offers some soil health value. I see Craig had another question about yield loss if you graze. This is a hard number to attach because, grazing can be pretty subjective, and how hard are you grazing and how long and how much are you taking out of that crop in the fall. I think it follows our winter wheat recommendations pretty closely, and that a typical graze, we would say, if we're backgrounding cattle in Oklahoma or something on winter wheat and then going to try and harvest it for grain, is that you're looking at a 20 to 30% yield loss, but that's with good grazing management, not overgrazing, things like that. I think it should follow pretty closely to those numbers. But again, proper grazing management really affects that number. So it's hard to just give you a blanket number of what that looks like.
Yeah, I guess what we've seen, even, we've had people plant open pollinated rye with the intentions of harvesting it for seed that next year. And they brought that question up too. Should I graze it in the fall, or can I graze it in the fall, and how much will it hurt my yield? And what we've seen is it hurts your yield enough where you wouldn't want to graze it in the fall. It's not going to be worth it. And maybe it's a little bit different with the hybrid rye, but if we're only expecting 40, 50 bushels of rye from open pollinated stuff, and now we're killing our yield by 25%. Well, it takes a lot of good grazing to make up for that.
Right.
So,
And I never, ever recommend spring grazing if you're trying to take a grain yield, because you delay that crop too much. You set yourself up for ergot issues. You drastically can hit yield if you have cattle out there while it's starting to elongate. So I never, ever recommend spring grazing if you are trying to get a grain crop.
Yeah, especially, so when we move into the upper Midwest and our growing season gets shorter, and we have less recovery time, I really wouldn't do it in South Dakota or in Minnesota either. I think it does hurt it enough where it's not worth it.
Yes, the seed is protected.
Which means it can't be planted on your own farm, even if you harvest it.
Correct.
Which is a little bit different, than other oats or all other cereal grains that we're used to. If you grow it, it needs to be fed or gone into the milling or distilling industry. If you plant hybrid rye, you need to start with foundation seed.
And you wouldn't want to replant. It's just like trying to replant hybrid corn. It's going to be very messy the next year and not worth your time, and it's going to diverge a lot. So you're not going to want to replant hybrid seed.
Perfect. Anybody else have any other questions? You shout them out or type them in. Otherwise, I think we'll call it a wrap. Perfect. Well, like Becca had her information up there. And if you have more questions or want to get in touch with either Warren or Becca, let us know. If you want slides or charts of some of this stuff, let us know. We've got this recorded, so we can send you that, or we can send you pieces of those PowerPoints too. So definitely appreciate everybody tuning in. It's kind of a fun, exciting topic. It's new, and anything new is fun to listen about. So we'll keep going down this path, keep learning more, and keep putting it into operations and figuring it out. But certainly a lot of potential here as we use more hybrid rye up here and keep learning about it. But yeah, thanks so much for tuning in, and have a great harvest season coming up here. And if you got more questions about this hybrid rye, certainly give us a call here.